campus of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we bring you the 7th program and the final one in our 7-week series on the topic Racism, Prejudices, and Progress. It's been a very special privilege for us to bring you these very, very important programs on one of the most important topics that we face today. Our final guest is a very special person and has been very enlightening with our students and our community. Our guest today is David Lehr, who is the Western States Council and fact-finding director of the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith. Our guest is certainly qualified and is well known in this area and has been most helpful in combating racism over the years. Our guest holds a BA degree from UCLA, where he also was Phi Beta Kappa, and he holds a law degree from that same institution. He's been interviewed and quoted numerous times in such newspapers as the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, the London Times, the Wall Street Journal, and others. And we're very privileged to have him. And David, we welcome you to our program.
Thank you, Tony. It's a pleasure to be here.
And I'm happy to have two members of the panel to assist today in the questioning of our guest on this important topic. First of all is Father Bill Wasmuth, who is the president of the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations. And I want to take this opportunity while he is here to thank both his organization and Father Bill himself for all the work they have done to make this week possible in cooperation with our organization, North Idaho College. We also have Dr. Dennis Connors, who is the Director of Planning and Associate Dean of Instruction at North Idaho College, and I shall invite Father Bill to commence the questioning.
Thank you, Tony. David, I would like to give you the opportunity, first of all, I guess, to explain to us briefly and to our audience what is the point and the goals and the activities of the Anti-Defamation League, if you would, please.
Well, the Anti-Defamation League was founded in 1913 by members of the Jewish Fraternal and Service Organization, B'nai B'rith. They founded it at that time for a variety of reasons. Two major ones were that there was a plethora of stereotyping and pretty vulgar anti-Semitism and racism that was prevalent in vaudeville and burlesque, where people were dressing up in blackface or putting on large noses and portraying themselves as Jews. And the people who founded the ADL figured, well, if they simply appealed to people who put on these shows and showed them the hurt that was resulting from what they'd done, how could any sane person not realize that they ought to change their act? And 3 or 4 years after they'd done a decent job of approaching these people, they could go out of business. Well, here we are 73 years later, we're still in business. Our appeals to reason and the sanity weren't completely successful then, and I'm afraid to say they're not completely successful now, but we keep on trying. And I think through our 30 offices around the country and our 3 overseas offices, we try and do a pretty good job of combating bigotry.
Thank you. Dr. Connors.
David, in your remarks at noon today, you talked about in recent years, 1940s, that there were strong advocates, and some of the data that you spoke about mentioned there were strong advocates in favor of eradicating this negative stereotyping, but you mentioned that there aren't any today. Do you see any on the horizon? What's the status of that? And does the Jewish population need a strong advocate in that regard?
Well, I think there are people who speak out vigorously against bigotry. There were in the 40s and 50s, and there are today. The point I was trying to make is I think there may be in too many instances, and I think the recent affair with Reverend Farrakhan in Los Angeles and in Washington, D.C. as well, points out that there may be a willingness on some people's part to kind of rationalize bigotry, to say, well, we ought to take into account where Mr. Farrakhan is coming from, and that he really has the best interests of poor black people at heart when he espouses his anti-Semitism. And the point that we trying to make at the Anti-Defamation League, and I think good people make all over the country, is that no matter good motivations, if a bigot is if someone is spouting bigotry, those good motivations don't mean very much. I'm sure Ku Klux Klan leaders who appealed to bigotry may have had intentions to improve the whites of the plight of poor whites in Appalachia. Well, those good intentions don't mean much when set against bigotry. And the point being that no matter how it's packaged, no matter the purveyor, if hate is part of someone's program, then the rest of that program ought to be ignored and disregarded because it's tainted.
What was the role of the Anti-Defamation League in that incident with Farrakhan? What did they do?
Well, our attempt, we worked as part of a coalition of a variety of community organizations to urge a response from good people in the community, from the mayor in particular, to speak out and set a tone, especially for the thousands of black people we knew would go to the forum in Los Angeles. And we thought a tone ought to be set to make clear that while Mr. Farrakhan had First Amendment rights to speak his mind, he oughtn't be perceived as speaking on behalf of the black community, and that people may want to go see him because he's a curiosity and he's a charismatic speaker, but they ought not be beguiled and bedazzled and enticed by his message. That there's hate is an essential element of his message, and no matter whatever blandishments he holds forth, that ought not be lost sight of.
I would like to pursue something that we did at the early part of this series, and would like to conclude with it too and get your expertise. We've been talking about the term racism for 7 weeks on this program, and I would like to ask you to define racism, and as you do, a second part of the question would be, why are some people racist? What makes them think and behave this way?
Well, perhaps it may be different from the answers you've gotten from other people. I think there's a little bit of bigotry and racism in all of us. I think it's a human frailty to want to categorize people in groups and evaluate people before you know them because of, like you like to look at a book by its cover and judge it, and we know that's wrong. I think people have to be taught to realize that you don't evaluate a person by virtue of how he looks or how he talks or the color of his skin or how he decides to worship God. And it's that susceptibility in all of us to rush to that kind of judgment, to draw generalizations on the basis of superficial characteristics that has to be combated against. And it's our view, and it's been buttressed by numerous studies that have been validated again and again and again, that the best way, indeed probably one of the only ways to combat racism and bigotry, is through education. People have to know that they're susceptible to this kind of thinking, and they have to have the educational equipment, the intellectual tools to realize that susceptibility and to fight it. And to say, well, you know, there I go, I'm stereotyping again. I can't judge all people the same way. Just because X person is black doesn't mean all black people are that way. Just because this person whom I don't like is Jewish doesn't mean all Jews are that way. Catholics, Protestants, Hindus, Asians, you name it. And it's by educating, by making people aware of that susceptibility, by making them appreciative of varieties and a multi-ethnic society in which we live, of the differences that people have, and to learn to look at those differences in positive light, as contributing something different to our society as opposed to something negative, differing from what the people are used to seeing, is what we think fighting bigotry is all about.
We've often heard that different theories, but one theory is that there are only two emotions, and one is love and one is fear, and it's out of fear that we have hate. Would you respond to that?
Well, that may well be true. I'm not a psychologist. That's my wife's field. But someone once told me there are really only two kinds of people: those who see something different and say, "My, that's interesting," and those who see something different and say, "Gee, that's different. That's disgusting. It's not what I'm used to." And maybe that's one way of looking at it too. If people would see something different and say, "Well, that's interesting. You know, maybe there's something there. Maybe there isn't," we might all be a little better off. But as I said, we are not kind of naive do-gooders, if you will, who think that it's going to bigotry and anti-Semitism and racism is going to be eliminated tomorrow or the day after. I think human history is too dappled with terrible stories of bigotry and what it can lead to, and that the people, there are always going to be bigots around. But I think we've done a pretty good job in the society of, especially over the last 20 or so years since the Civil Rights Acts were passed, to make it clear that there's a societal policy which will not tolerate bigotry. And while we can't eliminate bigotry in all its manifestations and private actions and how people view one another, we can make very clear that government and all agencies of government will not tolerate bigotry, and that whatever force government can bring to bear to change attitudes and to make life, try and give everyone an equal footing, will be used.
Thank you. Father Bill Wassman.
I agree with you very much, Mr. Lear, that education is extremely important and must be a constant sort of thing to help combat prejudice. I think accurate information is too, and not always does accurate information get handed on. I'd like to have your comments specifically about the 2020 incident several weeks ago, perhaps a couple of months ago now, that tied the Christian identity movement and some growth that was happening to that to the Midwest. Well, if you would, please.
Father, the point you raise is one that we feel very, very strongly about. ADL, part of what we do is to monitor extremist groups. I think probably the reason I was invited up here was because we have a certain expertise with regard to the Aryan nations, and especially far-right extremist groups that evidence anti-Semitism, racism, and are anti-democratic. Well, in combating those kinds of groups and studying them, I think one of the worst things one can do is exaggerate what the problem is. We are looked upon as a source for information by various news sources and by various academic groups because we are accurate. We try and be as accurate as possible. We're not in the business of scaring people. We're not in the business of sensationalizing and saying a group is growing when in fact it isn't growing. And that was, I think, one of the dangers of the 2020 broadcast of Seeds of Hate on a few months ago. The problem was, I think there was a preordained conclusion that the identity movement, the offshoots of the Aryan nations and the Posse Comitatus, the Covenant Sword and the Arm of the Lord, were being successful in recruiting farmers who indeed have very difficult economic problems, and that the seeds of hate that were being sown were somehow coming to fruition, bearing fruit. Well, every study we had done, and we had put a lot of people in the field going throughout the Midwest, talking to farmers, talking to law enforcement, talking to a variety of sources, came to the conclusion that indeed there had been lots of seeds thrown out there by these bigots, but that very few of these seeds had borne any kind of fruit. That in fact the good sense of the farmers prevailed, and they realized that the kind of hokum that was being fed to them, that they were told that they didn't have to pay loans that were due, that there was some worldwide conspiracy that had caused their economic problems and was calling their loans in, they just saw it was nonsense, and they weren't going to believe it. And that there wasn't, that while the incidents that were portrayed in the program were true of farmers, a few farmers having engaged in shootouts with the police, of meetings having taken place where hate was the product being sold, the fact is that when those bigots left town, there was little residue of what they had sown, and that the farmers just hadn't followed these people in any kind of significant numbers. And we made clear to ABC that the information we had provided them beforehand had been ignored, and that we felt it was a real disservice to engage in that kind of sensational journalism, which only aroused people unnecessarily. And as I think the story of the classic children's tale Chicken Little points out, if you yell the sky is falling when it's not falling, when you really have something to worry about, nobody's going to be listening to you. And that's the one fear we have. If you arouse people's fears without sufficient justification, when people really should be concerned, they're just going to yawn and roll over on the other side and say, well, I've heard that one before, nothing happened.
Other than watch media with some caution, perhaps, and call you when we have some doubts on these kinds of issues to get another perspective on it, what else could we do to,
I think to
get accurate info?
To perhaps realize the frailties of the various media. Television news magazine shows are a particular format that may thrive on, almost thrive on sensational kinds of broadcasts, and look at something with a questioning eye. I think it's very important for the public to understand that maybe everything isn't quite the way it seems on TV sometimes, and that if something generates interest, a particular broadcast on a controversial subject, maybe they ought to take the time to do a little research, to read about it, to see if what they saw on TV really is in fact an accurate representation of what's going on in the field. Frequently that isn't the case.
Thank you.
Dr. Connors.
Following up a little bit on media, David, 3-4 months ago, Joseph Mengele's body, her remains, were allegedly found down in South America, and certainly attention was focused on that. What is the position of the ADL on Nazi hunter organizations?
Well, we are not forensic pathologists, but I think the general consensus is that if the pathologists who examine the remains view it as being Mengele, then so be it. I don't think Mengele per se is the major issue. The fact is that we think Nazi war criminals ought to be pursued, that they ought not be allowed, people who murdered dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of people by virtue of what they did, ought not be allowed to die peacefully in their bed, never having been brought to the bar of justice. Mengele was a particularly outrageous example, but there are the best estimate from what I've seen by Alan Ryan, who used to head the Office of Special Investigations in the Justice Department, is that there's some 10,000 former Nazis who would qualify as war criminals, still free and running around South America, Western Europe, and the United States. And I must say that things have, if you would have asked me this question, let's say 7 or 8 years ago, it would have been a very different response, because that was before the Office of Special Investigations was funded. And I think the United States had a particularly sorry record of pursuing Nazi war criminals in this country for the first 30 years following the end of World War II. But that has changed considerably. The OSI has been especially vigorous in pursuing leads, in checking on the people who lied on their applications for entry into the United States. And there have been some major success stories on the part of the OSI over the past few years, and I think they're to be commended for it. Mm-hmm. And I think it's simply a matter of justice. No people, no individual who knows that a member of his family was murdered by someone would feel very rested knowing that the murderer has never been brought to justice. I mean, if it's hard on the abstract scale of thinking about what went on in the Holocaust to understand the feelings of people who lost relatives, but if someone put it on an individual scale, if you knew that there's someone who murdered your mother or your sister or your son or daughter is walking around with impunity, feeling that nothing will ever be done to him, I think that would be gnawing at your gut for a long time. Knowing that there is an effort being made now to bring those people to justice, to make sure that they don't just sail through life never having been asked to balance the scales, it means an awful lot to people who were touched by the Holocaust.
Recently, I have read some reports that there has been an increase in racism. Groups like the KKK at one time had far too much success in this country. In fact, the fact they existed at all is a very depressing thought. And then they declined, and membership has been on the rise to some extent, at least from some reports. Do you agree with that? And if so, what would be causing that to happen?
From all of our analysis, that is not the case. The fact is that the Klan had, of course, a resurgence during the 50s and 60s during the civil rights struggle in the South. They declined precipitously in the late 60s and early 70s, and then they began to rise again in the mid and late 70s because of a more dynamic leadership. The David Duke, for one, who was college educated, wore a suit and tie, and he avoided all the vulgar epithets which had marked Klansmen before. He wore a button-down collar. He'd go on TV and say, well, I don't hate anybody, but just doesn't it make you sick how Jews run this country? It wouldn't be great if blacks were deported back to Africa. Well, it didn't take much to figure out that this was the same old wine in a new bottle. And amazingly enough, and this was in 1979, 80, and 81, when inflation rates were soaring, unemployment rates were high, the economy was really in pretty bad shape, they didn't have much success. I mean, the Klan had risen from about 6,000 to about 11,500 at its height in 1979, 80, and 81, and then it just started to drop off. He ran into trouble with internecine squabbling between him and some of his lieutenants. Various groups split off. The leadership showed itself to be bankrupt. And just much as the order has engaged in these bizarre stunts, allegedly holding up armored cars and so on, well, they were caught on a pier in New Orleans about to try and take over an island in the Caribbean to gain money to run far-right activities in this country. So they went too far, and people saw them more as buffoons than as any kind of meaningful political leaders, and Klan membership has dropped down to about 6,000, 6,500, which is not to be ignored, but the trend is downward, not upward, which I think is something very positive.
I have a second question. I was fortunate to get, before you came here, an article that you had recently written for the Los Angeles Times concerning the Reverend Farrakhan visit to Los Angeles. And from my reading of that, I would like to give you the opportunity to express your views about the issue of racism, and how does that fit into who the messenger is? That if it's one messenger, it may be responded to in a different way than another one.
Well, one of the points I tried to make at the lecture today, and I think it's an important one from our point of view, certainly, is that we should all learn to be very intolerant of hate, intolerant of intolerance, and that no matter how the hate is packaged, whether it's packaged very slickly by a group like the Liberty Lobby or the Institute for Historical Review, which says that the Holocaust never happened, and they publish these quarterly journals that look like academic publications, or whether it's packaged in a message of hope, if you will, that Farrakhan suggests he's purveying, which I don't think is a message of hope. But if there's hate in the message, then we ought to disregard the message, because the messenger has, and the hate has tainted the entire package. And I think that's an important point that good people in our society ought not lose sight of. It's one thing to identify and be concerned with the plight of the downtrodden, whether it's the farmers in the Midwest, or it's blacks in the various ghettos in our society, or it's Hispanics who may face severe unemployment. But having concern for the downtrodden doesn't in any way, shape, or form justify bigotry being utilized on their behalf or by demagogues who seek to exploit them. In the case of Farrakhan, in all too many instances, we see leaders who are willing to apologize for his hate, or if not apologize for it, kind of blink their eyes at it and say, well, you know, that hate is just a small percentage of what he's talking about. As Andrew Young said, I like the other 90% of this package. Well, you can't sever the 10% from the 90%. That 10% makes all the 90% unacceptable. It just doesn't work any other way, because once people start saying you can sever the messenger of hate from his message, then you run into severe problems. Then a Klansman who thinks he's got economics to sell becomes acceptable, or a Richard Butler who goes to farmers who's got an economic, a populist message to mix with his hate might become acceptable as well. And I think that is intolerable for good people and very dangerous for our society.
Father Bill.
Mr. Lear, attention and consistent vigilance maybe is too strong a word to the whole continuing struggle with racism and prejudice. That subject has come up repeatedly during this past week. And when we become apathetic, it seems like there's a natural kind of tendency almost for prejudice to start rebounding again and growing. On the other hand, attention without panic and vigilance without persecution, I think would all be our goals. If from your travels and from your position, your expertise, could you make some suggestions to our community? You're pretty familiar with where we've been and where we are now. Suggestions to what we might do in the future so that we don't need another catalyst like Butler perhaps to spur us to not be apathetic if that's what we were in the past?
Well, I think this community, from what I know, can serve as a model because it wasn't fearful, it wasn't cowed into silence by the bullies and the bigots in the area. In fact, it spoke out vigorously, it organized itself, it coalesced a variety of groups together, religious, ethnic, and I think that's a real prime example of what should be done, of how people should react when bigotry surfaces. It doesn't help to close your eyes to it because it's not going to disappear. But as the old analogy goes, it's really like a virus that has to be isolated, and if the white blood cells or the red blood cells will overwhelm it. And I think, if we use the analogy, then we have to have a few black cells and a few yellow cells, and I don't know what other red cells, and they'll all work together, and the virus will gradually be eliminated, or if not eliminated, it'll be made impotent, hopefully. And I think you can't fool people. People, what did Abraham Lincoln say? You can maybe fool some of the people all of the time, and the converse and the contrapositive, I guess. But you can't scare them. You can't tell them something's worse than it is. People are too smart for that. But if the realization that there is a problem, and to counter that problem, people have to speak up and speak up vigorously. I think with leadership, as there has been in this community, that the virus will be isolated and not allowed to spread. And I think that's exactly what's happened. I mean, it's perhaps most interesting that the alleged crimes of the order were not conducted in the area from which they grew. If they wanted to rob a bank, apparently they went elsewhere because this was not a very hospitable environment for them to engage in their criminal activities.
Dennis Connors.
David, you come at the very end of this symposium on racism and prejudice, and we've listened to Julian Bond and we've heard Joel Mandelman, Deputy Chief Counsel for the Civil Rights Commission. But still in my mind there's one central issue here, and I keep coming back to it, is the government has some role in this. You are not a political entity, the Anti-Defamation League, but you do take positions. What is the role of government? Should they ferret out where there is discrimination, where there is injustice, where there is racism, or do they only enforce the laws of the land and only go so far? And perhaps speak to the idea of quotas, which Julian Bond on one hand said was very important. Joel Mandelman on the other said that's not our position, not our role.
Well, we certainly feel that the government has a role to play in combating discrimination. We were very active in passing and helping to lobby for civil rights laws, both in the various states and the federal law in '64. We have been amicus and curiae in briefs before the Supreme Court, lower courts on a whole variety of civil rights cases going back to 1946 and subsequent cases. But having said that, I must say we do not believe that quotas are the answer to the problems that beset minority groups in this country. In fact, we have been vigorous opponents from the DeFunis case through the Bakke case through the Weber case. We believe that numerical goals and timetables, that quotas are pernicious, that however much one believes in civil rights, however much one believes in non-discrimination, the answer to discrimination is not creating a new class of discriminated against people, be they the white majority or non-identifiable groups that are not the beneficiaries of quotas. We think that imposing quotas where you have this idealized sense of how society ought to distribute its jobs or anything else, or admissions to graduate schools or whatever, just doesn't comport with reality. And what we suggest is that affirmative action take place, whether in employment or a university, but that there be no guarantee of what the results are, because individuals vary in terms of their skills, and society just doesn't work that you take a slice of the pie at any level and you're going to find X% black comporting, which matches X% of black in the society generally, or X% white, or X% Hispanic, or X% Asian American. It just doesn't work that way. That various groups have a variety of skills, and that you cannot predict the outcomes of either entrance examinations or of employment qualifications examinations. I think there have been some very thoughtful articles written on the subject, most recently some absolutely, I think, brilliant pieces in the New Republic, and they very much reflect the thinking of the Anti-Defamation League and our view that quotas are not the answer. To ensure a discrimination-free society, you have to purge all hiring or whatever of discriminatory quotients, but certainly not quotas.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we're out of time, and on behalf of our staff and the students at North Idaho College and our community and the task force, we want to thank you very much. You've been great for our community and most informative.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been David Lehr, who has been speaking with us from the Jewish perspective, and I hope you've enjoyed the 7 weeks that we've been bringing you over this program. We've been so sincere to try to discuss what we believe is such an important issue, and we've talked about it from the black perspective, from the Jewish perspective, the Hispanic perspective, and the American Indian perspective. But we want to also remind you that there are other minorities that we have not had the opportunity to talk about, but they too deserve the same kind of attention. Please be with us again next week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.
Yeah, Tashia right